So, Steve, when we were starting out, you were kind of sending me like emails and a lot of stuff trying to get me ready for the industry. And you sent me like a question or so, like a problem that you kind of experienced. And I've kind of been thinking about it the whole time. So I wanted to like have that conversation with you. And the question wasn't even a question, sort of like an issue that you kind of run up against, which like I'll do the scenario that you said was client A wants to ship LTL and has 2 pallets. We give them a quote, we send it, they're happy with it. But then 2 days later, when the actual shipment's supposed to happen, they say they need 4 pallets. And then they're pissed at us when we say it's going to cost a little bit more money to ship 4. So when you send that to me, my first question is like, well, why would anyone be like, of course it's going to cost more. You just add 2 pallets. But then it sort of brought me to that next question of where is the disconnect happening? Like, why would a client be surprised when they've been told, hey, you're doing LTL, you're going to do 2 more pallets, it's going to cost more?
I think there's a lot of kind of curiosity and education opportunities around less than truckload shipping. If you think about the industry as a whole, $800 billion a year industry, something that's kind of widely quoted. Only 35 to 40 billion of that is LTL. So the majority of truckload spend certainly, and even moves is going in the truckload space. So at that point, you're looking at kind of flat rate or cost per mile, point A to point B types of moves, where LTL networks work totally different, and you're really paying for the space that you utilize on a truck. And I think for some clients, they're used to just getting a price at the beginning, whether it's through a broker or a contract carrier, and that kind of holds because they're shipping in the truckload mode. And then they come to less than truckload, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pallets, like you were saying, and the pricing structure totally changes, and they're not super familiar with that.
But I mean, like my guess is like this is more like closer to like a parcel type of shipment. It's still an item that you're shipping. Yeah. So is that really where the complication comes with the truckload and the pricing, or is there more to it?
It honestly, it's tough to say. I think that the main thing that you should be focusing on as an LTL shipper is that your freight, more often than not, is moving with other companies' freight. So other companies might have pallets on there as well, right next to your pallets. In fact, that's happening all the time in the less than truckload mode. So really, what they're trying to get at is having you pay for the space that you're taking up on the truck, and that's the commodity that they have to sell. So it is kind of a variable charge pricing dynamic versus kind of that flat rate truckload. So it is a little bit difficult to understand from the shipper's perspective where that confusion comes from. But I think it's kind of incumbent on us as partners of shippers to tell them about LTL, how it works, how the networks are set up, what these carriers are kind of capable of handling, and what's going to work well in their network and what's not.
Okay, well then I guess let's go into it. What goes into LTL pricing? What goes into less than truckload pricing? How's that all calculated?
Sure. So you're going to be looking at, we always like to start with kind of strategic relationships with our carriers. So I think the easiest way to kind of understand less than truckload pricing is to start with how you negotiate a contract, right? So when you're looking at negotiating LTL contracts, you're going to be looking at a base rate. So basically, the way that we talk about it internally is that a base rate is just an algorithm. There are inputs, which are going to be your freight class, which are going to be your weight, which is going to be your point pairs, so your origin zip and your destination zip. And then as on the back end of that, you're going to get a number, an amount of dollars. So the first thing to start with is kind of a base rate. And then you're going to be looking at taking a discount off of that. So you'll hear a lot of companies talk about their discount levels, and I have a 90% discount or a 95% discount. And what we see sometimes is that freight carriers will kind of use newer base rates, so a more current base rate, and they'll offer deeper discounts off of that base rate. So there's different ways that you can kind of negotiate LTL freight, but when you're looking at pricing it, you're really looking at base rate, you're looking at a minimum charge. So what would it cost to ship, say, a pallet 5 miles down the road? That's going to be kind of your minimum charge. So base rates, minimum charges, and discounts are really what you're kind of focused on.
Okay, that sounds simple, but so my understanding is that it's not that simple because base rates change. The freight class is the thing that kind of really matters. So I guess talk a little bit about that, because for the way you kind of describe it, it's just like the base rate's going to be this simple charge, but like
Hmm.
that changes based off of like the year, what base
Yep.
you're working off. The minimum, there's like a bunch of gaming to it. So I guess like
Sure.
explain to me that aspect of it.
Sure. To start with the base rates, I mean, first off, every carrier is going to have their own base rate. So if you're working with, potentially 8 different LTL carriers, you could be on 8 different base rates. And all of those base rates are going to get updated on an annual basis. The general guidance that we, here in the industry and talk to our clients and our prospects is anywhere from a 3 to 5% increase each year on that base rate. So the 2019 base rate would be, say 3 to 5% higher than the 2018 base rate for any given carrier.
Why is that?
Just from their perspective, they do a couple of different things. So they'll look to kind of balance their network. So if they have a lot of freight going in one spot and they're looking for some outbound, they might build some favorability into that base rate to incentivize shippers to use that pricing. It's also cost. So, cost of living, the fuel is treated separately with a surcharge schedule, but labor costs, investment in technology and new trucks, potentially insurance costs going up, driver pay the last couple of years has actually been, going up. So from their perspective, they're looking at, they tell you they're covering their costs on a year-over-year basis.
Okay. And I guess then let's go into freight class because that's
Sure.
sort of where like the base rate kind of falls, right? Or
So freight class would be what. So again, the goal for an LTL carrier is to really figure out to the best way that they can how much space you're going to take up on their truck, and depending on your product type and also how it palletizes, you're going to take up more or less space, right? So what a freight class is really trying to do is it's trying to take it's really a proxy for weight, density, and cost of the item. So the general guidance is the lower the freight class, so class 50 is going to be denser, lower value, and then higher freight classes are going to be more high value, less dense.
high value for
Cost in terms of cost.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's no real one-to-one tie on something like that. So freight class is it's dictated by the NMFC.
Okay.
So it's kind of a regulatory board that will say there's a one-to-one tie to product. So that's why it's really important that you have a good handle of kind of your products and your product descriptions when you're shipping freight, because those NMFCs are going to be tied to the product, and then which is tied to a class.
So so it's you like as the shipper who's saying what your class is, or is it a negotiate? Like where does that
So you
happen?
can negotiate it. The product to NMFC type is more or less fixed. There's some things that you would call density items. We were looking at some of those for a prospect last year that was shipping a lot of like home appliances, and some of those items, depending on how more or less dense they are, actually have different classes. So,
Okay.
But I think the easiest way to think about class is that it's basically set by an independent board based on what your product description is. But depending on how things are packaged, depending on how they're palletized, you do have opportunities to negotiate freight class with a carrier. That would be something that we would call like an FAK.
And that stands for
It's freight of all kinds.
Okay.
So really what you're looking to do there is treat classes not necessarily as the class that the NMFC is stated at. So for example, if you had something that was a class 65 shipment, so the NMFC says based on your product description, this is class 65. Well, if you think it handles closer to something like class 50, you might be able to negotiate with that carrier something that we would call an FAK. So every time that you would ship actual product class at 65, it would run from a pricing perspective at 50.
Okay. So how do you find out what I guess the class is? Where do you find all
Sure. So we use the SMC. So they have something we pay a license for it, a product called Fast Class, but it's pretty widely distributed in terms of. So go to the NMFC, and you can kind of plug in your product type, whether it's home appliances, food, really anything, and you'll be able to figure out exactly what that freight class is.
And so is it typical for negotiations to happen with the, like, FAK, or is that?
Yeah, we use. I mean, it's definitely a discussion point internally. Every time that we're going through a less than truckload negotiation. So what we're trying to do on the front end as part of our benchmarking process, and then again when we're kind of trying to think about pricing, is we're trying to look at the mix of actual class of a shipper. So, we kind of have shipper profiles, which is basically just our shipper statistics. So we're looking at, when things are shipping, where they're shipping, what the locations are, what the requirements are, who the customers are, what the weight breaks are, what the classes are. So we really get a good understanding of what that client is doing in the LTL space on a day-to-day basis. And then, based on all that information and really, kind of our benchmarking tools and 30 years of experience, from there, we're coming up with, what we think a fair market price would be.
Okay. So is that all that kind of goes into the pricing when it comes to, like, LTL shipments, or?
Yeah, from a technical standpoint, in terms of getting a price, I mean, there's other different ways of pricing LTL freight. Some companies in some industries honestly prefer a per pallet rate. So it doesn't, in the case of a per pallet rate, it doesn't necessarily matter what freight class you have, or it's more based on kind of state to state pairs and per pallet rates. So it kind of depends on how you want to approach it with your carriers. But if you're thinking about kind of traditional LTL pricing, the things that you're going to be wanting negotiating on are going to be, kind of your base rate, your discount levels, your minimum charges, your FAK, and then accessorials as well.
What about timing? Like, you mentioned that this is all something that your pallet is being shared with, like it's on the same trailer with, like, other, like, people.
Yeah, totally.
How does timing work with all that? Is it a guaranteed thing, or, like, what is that worked around?
No. I mean, in order to get a guarantee, which is something that we're seeing in the industry more and more, as major retailers are really kind of dictating, hey, you have to deliver this on this day, on this time, right? We're seeing some shippers to choose to pay those upcharges, but in order to guarantee a delivery, you need to pay for a guaranteed service, or else you're just kind of subject to when the freight's picked up, certain line haul schedules and how it happens. So we do tend to see, if we look at variance in terms of transit times, we do tend to see higher levels of variance in the LTL mode than say the truckload or the parcel mode.
So what are you shipping LTL? Like, what would you kind of typically do if, like, you can't guarantee a time that's going to be there? Or is that not something that really matters? Like,
it absolutely is for some customers. I think it just depends on who your trading partners are, right? So who are your customers?
okay.
On an inbound perspective, how flexible or not flexible is how are you going to run your operation, your dock doors? So I think it just really comes down to understanding what the requirements are for your business and for your partner's business.
Okay. What about? So I've heard this term, like, accessorial.
Sure.
What is that? Like, what are they? And then is it
sure.
it something that just, like, always is a part of LTL shipments?
No, not necessarily. I think the easiest way that I think about accessorials is LTL freight carriers, and really any freight carriers, are paid to pick up and drop off freight, right? And I think the general assumption there is that they're going to pick up from a place with a dock door where they have palletized freight that's going to move on their truck, and then the same situation is going to happen kind of on the delivery end. So the way that I think about accessorials is when freight carriers have to perform special services outside of really driving, they're gonna look to be compensated for that, right? So I'll give you an example, something like a lift gate charge. So if you're gonna deliver to here, kind of at Acord Park Drive, we don't have a dock door that a driver can back into, right? He can't unload that freight. So they're gonna have to figure out they're gonna have to bring equipment to get it off of the truck. So bringing that equipment, taking up space for that equipment, potentially, like, all those things incur costs from a trucking perspective. So they're going to charge you for it.
And that's, like, in addition to what goes into LTL pricing.
Yep. So if you think about kind of the basic components of a charge that you're going to see, potentially on an invoice, you're going to be looking at, your freight charge, fuel charge, which is something else you should be negotiating, and then your accessorial. So those are kind of the three main components of cost when we look at our on a prospect, client, whatever, whoever it is, really.
Is there a way to know what you're going to get charged accessorial wise? Like, if say, hey, we were going to have something shipped here to Acorn and we know that it's just not like we don't have a loading dock. Is there a thing you can do? Like, how important does your location play?
Oh, locations are super important. So that's kind of when we're coming up with our benchmarks, or negotiating on behalf of our client. We always say that we like to take a strategic approach, because I think understanding, what the requirements are that's kind of critically important to any negotiation. So in terms of how to negotiate accessorials, I think if you can get data on them and understand what is currently being charged on for a prospect, or if you want to take a look at yourself and do a little bit of self benchmarking, so understanding kind of the current charge, the amount of times it happens, the amount of instances, and then are these consistent charges? Are they variable charges? Is it $50 every time? Is it 50, then 75, and then 100, and then 20? I think that's really the place to start, is with understanding what those charge types are, understanding kind of your own and your customer and your supplier requirements for shipping, and then you can negotiate on those.
So LTL, it's not as one-to-one as because excuse my ignorance, it's all just like my Amazon buying, right? But it's like, I want this here in 2 days. I get Prime, or I do something where like I'm paying to have it delivered earlier. Yeah. LTL is different because you truly are just paying for a spot on the table, right? Like a spot in the truck.
Yeah. And so from an Amazon perspective, whether they're working with the Postal Service, with, the Postal Service, UPS, FedEx, who they don't do any work with anymore, or, kind of their own internal network that they've developed, like those SLAs are all negotiated with those providers. So there's no wiggle room on that. They set it up from a contractual basis, whether it's service requirements, whether there's some kind of a penalty for not delivering. So that's really all done at the negotiation level, and, paid for, at the negotiation level. So that's really where, in the parcel world, where you're going to see something like that. It doesn't just happen, right?
Right. Yeah. So it sounds to me like, if I'm breaking this all down, like the major headache for shippers comes in the fact that everything really is negotiable, in the sense like of what goes into the price of this.
Yeah. I think everything, if you're doing it,
and you're not used to that. Like you're used to a truckload where you're just going to A to B, or you're used to like parcel where it's like, hey, get it here at this time for me. Like that idea is that's where the headaches are.
Well, it's also, if you think about it in terms of, just let's kind of boil it down a little bit and think about negotiating a truckload versus negotiating kind of an LTL shipment. So again, truckloads they run from A to B, right?
Right.
And folks typically have high volume lanes. So if I'm going to negotiate a truckload, I can look at my data and say these shipments are running me between say $2,000 and $2,300 a shipment. I want lower rates. I've done some research. I've come up with some metric that says that I should be paying $1,700. So I'll go back to that carrier that I work with every day, and I'll say, hey, I'm paying you on average, $2,250 a load. I want to move it for $1,800. He might say, well, I'll give you $1,950, and then then you've saved money. It's not really how LTL tends to work. You tend to have a wider network, and you're not really basing it on a flat rate per lane. So I think approaching the negotiations a lot more difficult in terms of, how you ask. That truckload ask is very simple. Reduce my rates by 5%, 10%, right? On this point-to-point thing that I have data on. If I get a series of LTL shipments and I'm not really fluent in how transportation works, how less than truckload works, how the pricing works, it's really difficult to look at that rate and say, am I getting a good price or not?
So what can a shipper do to kind of get that going? I feel like we've talked a lot, and sort of as we wrap up, it's sort of just listen to this. Sounds like a lot of information you just gave, but what are some of like simple steps that they can do to kind of make those headaches go away?
Sure. I think when the first thing that you want to do is really collect data, which is something that we talk a lot about here. But if you don't really have access to that, one thing that you can do is ask your carriers for it. So go to the carriers that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, whether it's FedEx, Old Dominion, ADWE Pile, whoever this carrier is, go to them and ask them for their data. If they're not willing to provide that, which they should be,
Right.
I would say the next best thing is to ask them for kind of your current tariff or your contract. So then you can start to see, what is my base rate? What are my discount levels? Am I on a general rules tariff for accessorials, or do I have these kind of negotiated specifically? Is there an FAK involved? How does my pricing look now? So I think, kind of gathering information is always step one. I think one thing that we do internally that helps a lot of folks is we use a third party base rate. So for example, we use a Zarlight base rate that's licensed. So we pay for a license through Zarlight, which is and what they do is they have a third party base rate. So, whether we're using FedEx, whether we're using Redaway, YRC, Old Dominion, XPO, whoever kind of the carrier is, they're all on the same base rate. So that way we can look kind of broadly across our contracts. And if it's a 45% discount for YRC, you can compare that to maybe a 20% or a 60% discount for another carrier. So it puts everyone on a level playing field and allows you to kind of really understand the different aspects of the pricing. So I think that's some of the easiest things to do is kind of flatten out that base rate. It makes the analysis 100 times easier too, because you do have access to that. If you think about the world where you're on a bunch of different carrier base rates, like how do you even begin to rate those files, right? I think that's probably the easiest first step is get your contracts, collect data, pay for a Zarlight base rate, and then you at least have everyone working off of on a flat playing field.
All right. That sounds great. I guess shameless plug time. Talk about a little bit of like how having a consultant on your staff like Aborn can really help out with like almost eliminating a lot of that issue or a lot of that work.
Yeah. I think anytime that you're able to work with a company that's focused in one way, we're negotiating less than truckload contracts all the time. At any given time throughout the year, we might have 2 to 7 or 8 different contract negotiations going on behalf of our clients. So really you get good with a lot of experience, right? So it's the old adage, the way that you get really good at things is by doing it a lot and making a lot of mistakes and then not making them twice, right? So I think anytime that you have kind of a focused professional staff that can, you can work with and you can trust and is able to clearly kind of communicate and explain things and have things make sense and advocate on your behalf, I think that's a great benefit to shippers.
Awesome. So that's LTL pricing. I guess it helps explain it to me a lot more. I hope it helps explain to anyone else, but how can people get into contact with you?
I think the best place is always, again, shameless plug, go to the website, abornandco.com, abornandco.com. All of our, LinkedIn is also a great source to reach out.
Definitely follow you.
Anyone that wants to kind of connect on LinkedIn, more than happy to help. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for watching Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn and Company. If you liked what you saw, please share the video and like it. Also, subscribe to the channel to be notified when new episodes are posted. Thanks. Peace.